Hi, everybody. Just occurred to me as I was reading or going over Spencer's Faerie Queene this weekend, yesterday, and then looking at it a little bit today, I realized how strange it is for undergraduates to read a poem, not only the kind of poem that Spencer writes, which is written, I'm convinced more and more, I mean, it's obvious, I think, to be written purposely in a strange way. Um, I think there really is something consciously Game of Thronesy about it. We talked about other ways in which Spencer is using this mythic landscape to make arguments about Elizabethan authority and Elizabethan past and connectedness between a mythic past and a mythic present. But I think it's really important, and I want to emphasize this not only for Renaissance people, but for all of our students. It's very difficult to go back to reading 17th, 16th and 17th century texts, because that's all I do really. I mean, aside from reading 20th and 21st century novels, since it's all I do, I don't really think about the jump that it takes. And on the one hand, I'm definitely a historian, meaning I'm looking back at this as something foreign. But on the other, and I think this is a very important thing about reading in general, even though I'm a historian and I want to figure out what could Spencer have meant, what was he saying, who was he talking to, what was he responding to, what were the issues that were present during his period, what were the issues that were present for him. There still is the question of, or there still is the possibility that in that encounter with a text from the past, which is so different from me, it can change or help me think about who I am. I like the latter formulation. It can help me think about who I am. We go into this religious literature of the 17th century, and as soon as many of us, for many of us, as soon as we enter that realm, the realm of religion, we're ready for intolerance and dogma and simplicity. And there certainly is intolerance and dogma in many of the texts that we'll be reading. Those words are not available yet for them. But with that said, people like Spencer and Milton and Shakespeare, who is a Christian, think about issues that we think about in a very different set of languages. So when Spencer or Milton thinks about providence, God's providence, or free will, and does so in the theological terms that are available to them, that is Christian, the jump to make is to think about, oh, I'm now, and we talked about this in many other contexts, the act of reading is the act of translation. I'm reading this now. How do I translate it into my life? Translation, as we've discussed, involves two things. It involves, strangely, and they're contradictory, faithfulness to the past. I'm faithful to the past, but I'm also studying and reading, interpreting it with eagerness and alacrity. That is, as if I'm hearing something for the first time. That is, I'm making it my own. I'm taking it for myself. Good translators do this, right? They are faithful to Homer, but then they write a translation that the people in the 21st century or the 20th century or whatever can understand. That's why translations are always updated. Why we always need, because good translators have to be good poets, and good poets understand that the language changes, that people change, and therefore different generations need different translations. I love this image here, and this is one of the first humanists, the Dutch figure Erasmus of Rotterdam, and the engraving here is of Albrecht Dürer, who is one of the great artists of the millennia, or the millennium. And here he's representing the figure of the humanist Erasmus. And I find this particularly, for me, this represents a picture of what humanism is and what we try to do in our humanities classrooms. And we're not trying to be Christians like Erasmus, but we do adopt the form. And here the form which Dürer represents. Erasmus has a book open. There are books on the shelf. But he's also writing. And I think Dürer represents Erasmus in this manner because he's showing Erasmus through reading the past, writing himself. Yeah, I was just going back to check what the epigraph here means. This picture of Erasmus of Rotterdam was drawn from the life by Albrecht Dürer. Apparently, Erasmus was not happy with his with the work of Dürer, and this epigraph was added in the background. Um, with all that, I think, again, to just go back to what's important about this representation of the humanist, going back to the past. And that's the gesture which is so difficult for many of us today. And there are obstacles to go back to a tradition that seems antiquated or old. It seems antiquated or old because the people usually who are promulgating antiquated or old traditions are themselves turning the tradition into something static, and they're turning it into something antiquarian. When real traditions, and this is what Erasmus is doing here, he's discovering a classical, a pagan tradition. These books are pagan, right? Now we think, oh, how difficult it is for us to go back to Milton or to Spencer and to read about who cares about what their arguments about images, about representation of God. All the more so for Erasmus is going back to the pagans. They are non-believers, they're non-Christians, they're not even Jews, right? The pagans are on a lower level for early modern Christians than Jews. They don't believe in the one God at all. And yet, Erasmus goes back to these texts, and through it he writes himself. So going back, I've just mentioned representation of the divine. How do we think of the divine? How do we think of holiness? All of these issues can be translated even into our secular lives. And I think one of the things about the 17th century and the great things about the greatest writers during that period, the greatest artists during that period, is they turn the secular into something sacred. Dürer does this here. Milton does it. Shakespeare does it. I think the person who does it the most and the greatest is actually Rembrandt, who turns who shows, he doesn't show the sacred as the secular as sacred. He shows that the dichotomy is a false dichotomy. There's no distinction between sacred and secular. So going back to these 17th century texts, it's an effort for us. But once we go back to them and we see their languages, that's the important part about it being a historian. We have to figure out what they were saying and to whom they were saying. And from that, we can see the arguments they're making, even though in the end, we're not going to turn into 17th century Christians. That's not the aim. But we will in the end be able, through the languages they give us. What I mean by languages, the ways they give us to think about things that we didn't have before. Through those languages, we can think about ourselves. So that's where we go back to the Renaissance. For two reasons. They were the greatest writers, and the reason they were the greatest writers is because they were the greatest readers, and the greatest readers make us great readers. Yalla, have a great week.